It all started on an ordinary Thursday evening. James had just finished another long day at work, his briefcase heavy with files, and his mind heavier with deadlines. As he pulled into the driveway of his quiet suburban home, his eyes caught a familiar figure walking down the street. It was Claire, his neighbor, the woman who lived alone in the small brick house across from his. She was always polite, reserved, and carried herself with an air of quiet resilience. But that night, something was different. She wasn't just going for an evening stroll. She seemed purposeful, determined, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. Curiosity sparked in James's mind. Without fully understanding why, he decided to follow her at a distance, his footsteps soft and cautious against the dimly lit pavement. Claire walked with a brisk pace, heading toward the outskirts of town. The air was cool, and the faint hum of streetlights buzzed overhead. James felt conflicted. Part of him thought this was intrusive, wrong even, but another part whispered that perhaps Claire was in trouble, and maybe following her was the only way to find out the truth. She carried a small backpack, slung over one shoulder, and though she looked outwardly calm, there was a tension in her movements, as if every step was leading her deeper into a secret she had kept hidden from the world. James stayed far enough to avoid notice, but close enough to ensure he didn't lose her. Each corner she turned made him feel like he was stepping further into someone else's story, one he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, Claire reached a deserted part of town. The street lamps here flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Finally, she stopped in front of an abandoned community center, its windows broken, its doors covered with faded graffiti. James's heart pounded. What could she possibly want here? She slipped inside through a side door, moving like she had done this many times before. James hesitated, torn between leaving and stepping into the unknown. Against his better judgment, he followed, pushing open the rusted door just enough to squeeze through. The air inside smelled of dust and decay, but faint voices echoed from the back. He crept closer, his pulse quickening with every sound. What James found inside left him speechless. Claire wasn't alone. A small group of people had gathered in the main hall of the building. Men, women, even a few children. Some sat on worn blankets, others leaned against the walls. They all looked exhausted, weary, and yet their eyes lit up as Claire entered. She set her backpack down and began distributing food containers, bottles of water, and even small medical supplies. James's chest tightened as he realized what he was witnessing. This wasn't a secret meeting. It was a refuge. Claire, the quiet woman he had seen every morning tending her garden, was secretly running an underground support network for the homeless, the forgotten, and the struggling souls of the city. James stayed hidden, watching as Claire knelt beside a frail older man, gently bandaging his hand with practiced care. Her movements were steady, tender, and filled with a strength that had nothing to do with muscle or power. He saw her comfort a young mother with 2 children, offering them food and a blanket. He saw her laugh softly with a teenage boy, encouraging him to stay in school. Every gesture, every word, carried a kind of strength that James had never encountered before. This wasn't about dominance or control. It was about compassion, resilience, and the courage to keep giving even when the world seemed to take everything away. James finally stepped back, overwhelmed by what he had discovered. The Claire he thought he knew was just the surface, a polite neighbor, quiet and unassuming. But beneath that exterior was a woman who carried an entire community on her shoulders, silently and without recognition. He realized then that true strength wasn't measured by titles, wealth, or outward displays of power. It was measured by the sacrifices one made, the burdens one carried for others, and the love that persisted even in the darkest places. James walked home that night with a newfound respect not only for Claire, but for the countless unsung heroes who lived among them. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things without ever asking for credit. The next morning, James saw Claire again, watering her small row of flowers by the porch. She smiled politely, just as she always had, as if nothing had changed. But for James, everything had changed. He carried with him the image of her in that abandoned building, surrounded by people who saw her not as a neighbor, but as a lifeline. He didn't tell her he had followed her. Some truths were too sacred to expose. Instead, he simply nodded back, silently honoring the quiet warrior she was. And in that moment, James understood the true definition of strength. It was Claire. For days afterward, James found himself reflecting on what he had seen. At work, he noticed how trivial his frustrations were compared to the struggles Claire helped others endure. The paperwork, the endless meetings, the shallow office politics, all of it seemed insignificant. Meanwhile, across the street, lived a woman who carried the weight of strangers' lives without complaint. James began to look at the world differently. The cashier at the grocery store, the janitor in his building, the tired bus driver. He wondered how many of them were quietly fighting battles no one knew about. He realized that strength wasn't always loud or visible. More often, it lived in silence, hidden beneath ordinary lives. There were many moments when James wanted to approach Claire, to tell her how much he admired what she was doing. He wanted to say, "I know your secret, and I think you're incredible." But each time the words formed in his mind, he stopped himself. He understood that her work thrived in the shadows, away from recognition or attention. If the wrong people found out, those she helped might be at risk. And so, he chose to honor her secret by keeping it. Instead of speaking, he showed his respect in small ways, offering to mow her lawn when he was already cutting his own, leaving fresh bread on her porch without a note, or shoveling snow from her walkway in the winter. Claire never asked questions. She simply accepted these gestures with a grateful nod, perhaps suspecting more than she let on. Over time, a quiet bond grew between them. They never spoke about the abandoned building, but they didn't need to. When their eyes met across the street, there was an unspoken understanding. James began volunteering at a local shelter, inspired by what he had seen. He never followed Claire again. He didn't need to. That one night had been enough to change him forever. But sometimes, when he passed the old community center, he would glance at the boarded-up windows and feel a swell of pride, knowing what happened inside those walls because of her. It was as if the building itself had transformed from a forgotten ruin into a temple of strength, hope, and unseen courage. What James didn't realize was that his quiet support created a ripple effect. The small acts of kindness he adopted spread outward. His co-workers noticed how patient he had become. His friends observed how much more willing he was to listen instead of talk. One evening, a colleague asked him why he had changed. James only smiled and said, "I just realized strength isn't about proving yourself. It's about carrying others when they can't carry themselves." He never mentioned Claire's name, but her influence echoed in everything he did. Strength, he learned, wasn't something you displayed for the world. It was something you lived, quietly, day by day. Years later, when James looked back on his life, that single night still stood out like a lantern in the dark. He had seen many things since then, promotions, losses, victories, defeats, but nothing compared to the moment he followed Claire and discovered her hidden world. By then, Claire had grown older, her hair streaked with silver, but her spirit remained unbroken. She still watered her flowers each morning, still carried her quiet strength with dignity. And every time James saw her, he was reminded of the truth he had learned. Strength isn't loud, it isn't proud, and it doesn't demand recognition. Strength is Claire, strength is sacrifice, and strength is love that never quits. And though the world may never know her name, James knew she had changed his life forever. Time moved steadily, as it always does. James grew older too, his hair thinning, his steps slowing, but his mind remained sharp. Through every season, he would glance across the street to find Claire tending her flowers, no matter how tired she looked. In the heat of summer, she would be there, pulling weeds with determination. In the biting chill of winter, she would brush snow away from the fragile plants, protecting them like old friends. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than a neighbor's gardening habit. But James knew better. He knew the flowers were more than flowers. They were symbols of her quiet strength, reminders that life, no matter how fragile, was worth nurturing. And every time he saw her there, his heart swelled with gratitude, for she had unknowingly given him the greatest gift, the courage to live with compassion. Inevitably, the day came when Claire was no longer on the porch. Weeks passed, and James's heart grew heavy with unspoken worry. One morning, he saw a small group gathered at her home, neighbors, a few family members, and some faces he didn't recognize. That was when he learned that Claire had quietly passed away in her sleep, leaving behind no children, no fortune, no headlines. Yet to James, and to those whose lives she had touched, she left behind something far greater, a legacy of quiet strength. As he stood among the mourners, James noticed people who had once gathered in that abandoned community center, men and women whose lives she had helped hold together. They were there to honor her, not with grand speeches, but with tears, silence, and the kind of reverence reserved for saints who walk unnoticed among us. After her passing, James couldn't help but feel the emptiness across the street. But soon, he noticed something remarkable. The flowers Claire had tended still bloomed, brighter than ever, as if refusing to let her memory fade. Inspired, James began watering them himself, carrying on the small ritual she had practiced faithfully for years. It started with just him, but soon other neighbors joined in. One day, a young boy asked him, "Why do you take care of her flowers?" James smiled gently and replied, "Because they remind us of her strength, and strength like that should never be forgotten." Slowly, her story began to spread, not through books or newspapers, but through the lives of those she had quietly saved. The seed she planted, both in the soil and in the hearts of others, continued to grow. Years later, when James himself was old and frail, he often sat by his window, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. Children who never knew Claire laughed as they ran past them. Neighbors paused to admire their beauty, and strangers took photos, marveling at their resilience. To everyone else, they were just flowers. But to James, they were a living monument. Each petal carried her memory, each bloom whispered her story, and each root held the essence of what he had learned so long ago, that true strength does not boast, does not demand recognition, and does not fade with time. It endures in the lives it touches, and though the world may never carve her name into marble or history books, James knew that as long as the flowers bloomed, Claire's strength would live on forever. As the years passed, James noticed something extraordinary. Claire's story began to take root in ways he never imagined. The neighbors who once only nodded politely at one another now greeted each other with warmth and kindness. Small acts of compassion began to spread. Meals left at doors, help offered without being asked, strangers looking out for one another. James knew, deep down, that this ripple of goodness traced back to her. Claire's flowers had become more than a garden. They were a gathering place. Couples took photos there on their wedding days. Children posed for school pictures, and families rested on the curb just to admire their colors. And while none of them may have known her full story, they all felt something, an invisible thread of resilience, kindness, and strength that lingered in the air like a blessing. One evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sun set behind Claire's old home, A young woman from the neighborhood approached him. She had often seen him tending to the flowers, trimming them carefully, watering them with the same devotion Claire once had. "Mr. James," she asked gently, "why do you care for those flowers so much?" James smiled, his eyes misty with age and memory. He thought for a moment before answering, his voice soft but steady. "Because they remind me of someone who showed me what true strength really means. A kind of strength the world doesn't see, but desperately needs. And as long as these flowers bloom, her strength blooms too." The young woman nodded, her face touched by the weight of his words. She didn't know Claire, but in that moment, she carried a piece of her story forward. Inevitably, James's own life reached its final chapter. He grew weaker, his body slowing, but his spirit remained tethered to the flowers and the story they carried. On his last spring, he sat by the window, breathing in the scent of blossoms drifting through the breeze. He felt peace, knowing that the strength he had witnessed so many years ago had not been lost, but had multiplied, carried on by others. When James passed, the community mourned him deeply. Neighbors remembered his kindness, his quiet presence, and his devotion to the flowers across the street. At his small service, the young woman he once spoke to shared his words. "As long as these flowers bloom, her strength blooms too." The people listened, and for the first time, many truly understood that the flowers were not just a garden. They were a story, a legacy, a definition of strength made visible in petals and roots. Long after both Claire and James were gone, the flowers still grew, vibrant and untamed. Generations came and went, but the blooms remained. Children who had once asked about them grew up and told their own children the story of the woman who nurtured them and the man who kept her memory alive. Strangers passing by felt comfort without even knowing why, as if the blossoms themselves whispered strength into their hearts. And though their names were never etched into monuments or history books, Claire and James became something even greater. Eternal reminders that true strength is not found in power, wealth, or recognition. It is found in compassion, in sacrifice, and in love that refuses to die. And so, as long as the flowers swayed in the wind, their story lived on, a story of strength that touched every soul who paused to notice. As the years passed, the flowers began to be known across town as Claire's Garden. No official plaque marked the spot, no government declared it a landmark, yet people treated it with reverence. Couples visited before life's biggest decisions, children left little trinkets among the petals, and those who were grieving sat quietly by the blooms, drawing comfort from their silent strength. The roots of memory ran deep, not only in the soil, but in the hearts of those who paused long enough to listen. The story of Claire and James was told and retold, shifting with each voice but always carrying the same truth, that real strength lives in love and sacrifice. Even newcomers, who never knew either of them, found themselves moved by a power they couldn't explain, as if the very earth remembered and passed on their legacy. One spring, a teacher from a local school began bringing her students to the garden. She told them about a woman who once tended these flowers and a man who honored her memory. She never mentioned their last names, because by then, their legacy no longer belonged to one family, but to everyone. The children listened wide-eyed, and some wrote essays about what they thought true strength meant. Others promised to do small acts of kindness in their own lives. Slowly, the story moved beyond the town, carried in the memories of those who once stopped at the garden and felt its quiet power. Claire and James had never sought fame, yet in death, they achieved something far more enduring. They became part of a living tradition of kindness, whispered across generations, like a prayer too sacred to fade. And so, the flowers continued to bloom, through storms, through winters, through the endless turning of time. They bloomed for the forgotten, for the broken, for the weary souls who needed to believe that strength still existed in the world. Each petal that opened was a reminder that compassion never truly dies. It only transforms, passing from one heart to the next. Though the world would never know their full names, those who felt their story understood something deeper. Strength does not live in stone statues or in golden trophies. It lives in acts of quiet love, carried on by those brave enough to believe in it. And with that, the story of Claire and James found its final resting place, not in history books, but in the eternal bloom of flowers that never stopped whispering. Strength is love, and love never ends.